Welcome to Raytown Chop Shop and the KawaBunga build, Part 8.
One of the most exciting parts of any build is the first test drive. Just like my first test drive on this Indian Classic back in 2014, Austin and I went to the Indian dealer in Olathe, Kansas and spent the whole day riding, looking, and dreaming about owning a new Indian motorcycle.
Now, let's stop dreaming about driving the KawaBunga. Let's do it.
We have a few things to do before we roll the KawaBunga out of the shop for the first test drive. Austin ordered two 90-inch accelerator cables from Go Power Sports. The original Kawasaki cables are on the handlebars and there's no way they can reach back to the engine now. He routed the new cables and modified the clamps that hold the ends of the cables at the carburetors.
Once I had the new cables clamped in place, I tested the new setup at the carburetors. I notched a piece of flat bar that will be used as the bracket for the accelerator cables.
Since we had more than enough length to connect the original and the new accelerator cables, we didn't have to fabricate a connecting tube like we did on the clutch. Austin had the bright idea of fusing the two lead stoppers on the ends of the cables by melting more lead on top of them, creating a strong connection. We clamped a piece of angle iron toward the front of the go-kart so we could leave all the cables connected to the handlebars and engine. We built a sheet metal trough for the ends to rest in so the melted lead wouldn't run all over the place.
I welded the bracket to the frame rail, installed the cables, and worked the throttle. Both cables move back and forth just like they're supposed to. I ordered a custom brake line from Spiegler Performance Parts. They had a couple questions when I called in the order. They wanted to know why the line was going to run from a front brake lever to a rear caliper, and why did it have to be 8.5 feet long. I told them it was for a go-kart with a motorcycle engine. He said, "Oh, I get it now." I routed the brake line from the handlebars, along the frame rail, back to the rear caliper, and zip-tied it to the frame.
We specified that the banjo fitting on one end of the line had to bend at 20 degrees to match up with the mounting angle on the caliper. It just so happened that the bend was going in the completely opposite direction that we needed it to. The folks at Spiegler must have known this happens a lot, because they included a simple little tool to spin the banjo fitting around 180 degrees. Worked like a charm. With the banjo fitting at the proper angle, Austin connected it to the rear caliper using the new crush washers included with the brake line.
I zip-tied the rest of the brake line once it was installed.
After Austin torqued down the bolts that connect the banjo fittings, it was time to bleed the new brake line. Not one of my favorite things to do on any vehicle. Good thing this video is in fast motion. It's amazing how much bleeding you have to do to pump 8.5 feet of air out of a new brake line. All in all, it took almost half an hour of squeezing the front brake lever, popping open the bleeder valve, adding more brake fluid, squeezing the front brake lever, popping open the bleeder valve, adding more brake fluid, well, you get the idea.
Time to test the brake. I fired up the engine. Let the clutch out. Got the rear tires turning. And hit the brake. We're in business.
Now that it can go and stop, it's time to work on the shifter. Here, Austin's using a little friendly persuasion to bend the 3/8-inch steel rod 90 degrees.
I bent the other end of the rod 90 degrees also.
We used the original brake rod off the go-kart to make the shifter rod. It was almost 3 feet shorter than we needed it to be, so Austin proceeded to cut the original rod in half. Now, just like the clutch cable, we're going to have to make something to connect the two ends of the shifter rod.
The original shifter lever was completely at the wrong angle, so I took it off. I used a hacksaw to cut off the original lever. I cut off a piece of flat bar and placed it 90 degrees from where the original lever was located.
Here's a little tip that may come in handy for you someday. Always check to make sure you've removed any rubber or plastic bushing from the piece of metal you're going to weld. We learned the lesson the hard way when Austin welded on the new shift lever. The plastic bushing used to be in that hole where the shoulder bolt goes.
Luckily, I had a rectangular chunk of acrylic left over from turning some fountain pens for a couple of friends. We're going to try to use this in place of the plastic bushing we just melted. I started turning it down. Once I had it rounded off on the outside, it was time to drill the hole for the shoulder bolt. I started with a centering bit, then a bit about half the size of the final hole, and then the right size bit for the shoulder bolt. With the hole drilled, I went back to work on the outside diameter of the bushing. I stopped occasionally to measure the outside dimension. One last pass ought to do it. The bushing wall is getting really thin. Time for a test fit. The shifter lever slides over the bushing. And the shoulder bolt fits perfectly.
On the shifter pedal, we decided to give ourselves the option of being able to change the travel distance necessary to shift gears. We drilled holes in a piece of flat bar that Austin tack welded to the shifter pedal. Once we were sure the drilled plate was at the correct angle, we made the final weld. We also drilled holes in the shifter lever that he had welded on earlier.
Time to mount the shifter pedal to the frame. I cut off a piece of round tube that slid over the bottom leg of the shifter pedal. Dad made sure the shifter pedal was straight up and down. I tack welded it in place.
Austin hit it again with the welder. Once it was final welded, Austin checked the movement of the shifter pedal.
Time to connect everything together. I inserted the shifter rod into the shifter pedal and put a cotter pin in it. I connected the front rod in the center tube. Then the back rod. The shifter lever is in place. And just over about 6 feet long. We used a spare welding glove as a blanket while I tacked the shifter rods and tube together.
Here, you can see how long the shifter rod is. Austin is 6 feet tall, well, 6'3" if you count his beard. Being as long as it is, we're already anticipating issues with flexing.
I final welded the shifter rod and tube and slid it back into place in the KawaBunga. We used the center holes on the shifter pedal and shifter lever as a starting point to see if this thing was really going to work.
And just like we thought, there's a lot of flex in the 3/8 inch rod. That's going to make shifting gears pretty spongy, if at all. Our first thought was to put some braces underneath the rod to cut down on the flex. We used a couple of 2x4s first to see if our idea was feasible. A lot less flex, but really ugly.
We needed 2 more brackets for the accelerator cables. The hose clamps we put on temporarily were squeezing the cables a bit too much. I cut a slot in each of the brackets so that the cables could fit inside.
We used the spare welding glove as a welding blanket to protect all the wiring we'd done earlier, while Austin tacked the rear accelerator cable brackets on the frame. Once the brackets were in place, we slid the cables into the slots. With the front and rear accelerator brackets in place, It looks like everything is going to work.
I adjusted the tension on the accelerator cables to take out any free play. Looks like we're ready to go.
We rolled the KawaBunga outside and Austin fired it up. Note the GoPro camera on his forehead. I'm sorry to say it didn't work, but he sure looks cool wearing it.
And I'm off and running on the very first drive of the KawaBunga under its own power. I managed to hit third gear halfway across the front yard.
Here, Austin almost runs over the cameraman. Me. Now, not that my yard was anything to write home about in the first place, but I expect there'll be a lot less grass to mow once Austin gets done driving the wheels off the KawaBunga.
At 67 years old, the hardest part for Dad driving the go-kart was getting in. He's taking it a lot slower than I did, which is weird since he used to be a drag racer. Must be an age thing. Notice how the front wheel came up when he climbed up the hill. That's going to happen when you don't have any suspension on a rigid frame. There's one more thing I wanted to do. This is our main driveway, about 200 feet long, straight uphill. This thing is going to be a blast.
Quite a milestone. Now that we know the KawaBunga is going to run, it's a big incentive to finish it up.
The first test drive was a success. Just like my first test drive on an Indian Scout. After one ride, I was hooked. 5 years and 3 motorcycles later, I bought my first Indian, a 2018 vintage. And here's Mom on her 2018 Indian Chieftain, and Dad on his 2015 Indian vintage.
Well, that does it for part 8. Thanks for watching.